Okay, for this lecture, we're going to be talking about sports and mass media, and we're going to be entering this conversation really with three of the more common theoretical perspectives when looking at how the media and how our media consumption shape how we think about the world around us. The first is agenda setting. So you may have encountered these in a number of your classes previously, but I'll go over them really briefly here. Agenda setting is effectively telling us what is important and what's not important. It doesn't tell us how to think, but it tells us what to think about. So what stories make the front page, or what stories make Sports Center or sports talk show, and what stories don't. And then from that, that carries the conversation over to fans talking to each other, or just everyday citizens, what conversations they have based on what the media is talking about. Framing goes a little bit deeper. There is actual persuasion in how you think about issues based on word choices, sources, viewpoints, what perspective the media take. We'll be looking at that a little bit later in terms of ESPN and its dominance in sports media, and how they can shape or reshape how we think about issues or athletes or scandals. And then the third is schema theory. So schema theory is really a psychological theory more so than a media theory. It effectively says we have a schema for everything in the world around us. So you have a schema for college. I have a schema for college, for professors, for police, for your parents, for your job. You have a schema there's a schema for a house. So when you think of the term house, something pops into your mind that's sort of the representation of all possible houses. There's a schema for everything, including yourself. So a self schema is sort of the view of how you think you are. And again, the schema is a simplified version. So the whole idea here is that we don't want to sort of give the cognitive effort to really deeply think about everything possible. So we just create a schema, and that kind of is our go-to. So when we're thinking about a bear in the woods, we have a schema for it, and we see it, and our schema probably has to do with fight or flight type of response, a sense of alarm, generally speaking, being afraid and running away, something like that. Again, schemas for absolutely everything, and they're mental shortcuts, really, is what a schema is. They become problematic, especially so when we start to apply those schema to individual humans. That comes out as a stereotype. So when we treat all humans, perhaps of a certain race or a certain gender, in the same way because we have a schema about that race or about that gender, then it becomes very problematic. So those are the three that we'll be entering the conversation with today. Touching base a little bit deeper on agenda setting. So this would play out in the top stories, what gets the most conversation, what's presented as the most important issues to society. And we can think about this in terms of sports, or just think about it in terms of all possible topics that the New York Times might cover, or one of the morning news shows or the evening news shows would cover. But if we're thinking about it in terms of sports, this might be what shows up on Sports Center, or what shows up on the sports page in the newspaper. It might be what shows up on sports talk shows. So ESPN's morning hours are largely filled with what were once radio shows that have now been turned into TV and radio talk shows. So what issues are brought up and why are they placed into those shows is really the question. Because if there are 5 issues to discuss within maybe a half-hour time segment, those 5 issues are placed in there in place of any other possible issues. So if there's some content that might be more important to society, or that it'd be valuable for listeners to hear, but they don't perhaps get the best ratings, those topics won't be brought in. So we see the usual suspects lineup of topics that are almost always brought up in these sports talk shows. First and foremost, you can always do lists like who are the top 5 centers in the history of NBA basketball, or is LeBron better than Jordan? And those types of conversations always get brought up because they're easy to talk about. They get decent ratings, but it's certainly wouldn't be considered maybe the most worthy or the most important issue going on in the sports or society landscape. Other topics: Dallas Cowboys, LeBron, the Lakers, Tiger Woods, Yankees, Brady. Almost anything in the NFL gets decent ratings if you're talking about it. So those are the stories, and those are the discussions that typically happen because they drive ratings. But that's a separate issue from what's most important to talk about. And you might argue that there isn't a one set way to figure out what's most important. The ESPN is providing its audience with what gets the best ratings, and maybe the audience telling them by watching or listening is showing what the audience feels is most important. There's an argument to be made there. But generally speaking, we can at least agree on whatever topics they do decide to cover is at the exclusion of other topics they're not able to cover. And this is really at the heart of agenda setting. Of these 6 things are what we're going to talk about. These are the most important issues, or the most the issues that have the most interest from our audience. So this is what we're going to focus on, and it really leaves the conversation dry in a lot of other areas that are maybe needing or worthy of discussion. All right, the readings move into schema theory with respect to masculinity and femininity, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. So like I said, schema theory applies, it's a larger psychological theory that applies to anything you can possibly think of, you can have a schema about. So space travel, you have a schema about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a child, a parent, all of these things we have schemas about. Again, they're mental shortcuts that we click into place, and we get a broad understanding of something based on an application of a schema. So what the reading argues is that traditional schemas, at least regarding in the sports world, and we'll have a discussion here in a second of whether we think this is changing, but traditionally the schemas for masculinity and femininity in the sports world are as follows. Masculinity is a schema of power, physical dominance, control, aggression, winners and losers, guts and determination, self-sacrifice for the good of the team, sacrificing health or finances for the good of the team. A lot of these probably make sense, or seem that there's like, yeah, that's what's been happening. And on the contrary to that, the femininity side, the schema for what it means to be a woman in sports is generally been seen as weaker, more of a peripheral role. Oftentimes, especially the farther back you go, more of a prize for those who are masculine. So we think of the female roles around a boxing ring, where we have a hyper-masculine 2 combatants in the center, and then women effectively carrying cards around the ring, showing what round it is. Also similar types of prize for masculinity in terms of aggressive, powerful, physically dominant football players and cheerleaders on the side, captain of the football team, and the head cheerleader kind of mentality. Again, at least that's what it has been traditionally. Let's go into a discussion about that. So what do we think about those portrayals of masculinity and femininity in the sports world? What stands out? What are examples of it? What are perhaps challenges to it? So that's the first item. The second item is, do you think those portrayals are still the same as they were described in the reading, or do you feel they're changing? If so, in what ways? What ways do we still need to continue to work? So discuss those, what we are hoping is antiquated or more traditional, older versions of masculinity and femininity, and how it plays out in sports, what stands out there, and then are there places where it's changing? This is your first discussion prompt. So open up the discussion window, hop on over and answer these couple items. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about sports masculinity and femininity. So the reading moves into calling sports as a male preserve. So we might think of this as like a wildlife preserve, where this is a place where whatever gazelles can live sort of undaunted by the rest of the world. They can just go do their own thing, be their own thing, and have a happy gazelle life. The reading considers sports as that type of preserve for males, where they can escape effectively. Men can be men escaping from women, you would think, or children, or anything else that prevents them from being men. I use my sarcastic sort of air quote voice with men. Places like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, Super Bowl, modern examples are sports bars, man caves. We also see this as a male preserve and showing up in advertising, where if you simply buy the right products, you can dominate the competition and become a winner. So things like Axe body spray and a lot of alcohol sales have this as well in their commercials, where you open a can of whatever beer and suddenly it's a party with scantily clad women all over, and the women are effectively trophies that you've won for choosing the right beer. But again, all of this is surrounding this notion of men can be men in the world of sports, and often at the exclusion of others. So children and women aren't sort of allowed in the club. Again, the modern examples of the man cave and sports bar. The reading continues on, talking about the connections between this masculinity and militarism and patriotism. So we have these hyper-masculine roles regarding men and women in sports. And then we also have, especially in football, where the reading was focused in, the hyper-masculine gender roles, particularly with regards to play, the field of play and in the periphery. We also see this in terms of media coverage and broadcast. It's perhaps changing a bit, but at least traditionally was always men occupying the broadcast booth. And if a female was involved with the broadcast at all, it would be relegated to a sideline reporter. And we still see that largely, although things are changing a bit, thankfully. The reading also continues on with connecting patriotism and sort of militarism as a representation of patriotism, which aren't necessarily the same thing. Being patriotic doesn't mean it has to be militaristic. You may be patriotic in other ways. But with the NFL and the sort of the hyper-masculine version of all of this, patriotism plays out as militaristic dominance. So you have flyovers, huge presentations of the flags, supporting the troops, and sort of seeing patriotism as connected to war and violence and military, rather than perhaps just love of country. Additional connections with military just come in the terminology that comes with football, which is effectively a representation of a land war. So you have one side trying to move the line of scrimmage or the line of combat and press the other team further back. So you have a ground assault, aerial assault, blitzes, trenches, all sorts of terms that are based in military or based in war that are applied to football. And again, like I said, the general play of football is a land acquisition battle, where you have an offensive side, a defensive side, just like a land war. All right, let's move into ESPN framing and agenda setting. All right, so ESPN, as all of you know, owns the rights to almost everything. I won't say they own the rights to everything, but they are certainly still the biggest voice in the sports world. Most sports fans, even if they don't have ESPN listed as their #1 content source, either indirectly or in some other means, have content that's generated through ESPN that comes to them. So all of the reporting gets bounced around, whether you're Fox or CBS or some online Barstool or anything else. ESPN is still the incredibly powerful voice in the room, more influence than any other outlet. So they have a powerful role to play in terms of framing events, framing people, agenda setting of what stories are most important. So again, agenda setting is what stories are important, and framing is how those stories get discussed. So why is that important? In terms of agenda setting, it's who makes the list, who gets talked about, what sports get covered. So if you have maybe 10 highlights pieces, what sports are included in those 10 highlights pieces? And again, it oftentimes probably goes back to ratings more so than maybe what's the most important sporting events happening. So there might be a women's playoff game versus a men's regular season or a men's preseason game. So the playoff game would just by definition be more important than a preseason game, but that isn't necessarily what gets covered. So that would be more of an agenda setting. Also, the agenda setting of women in the booth versus men, of who gets sort of priority, who gets to lead the conversations. So this also, you might think of this on a Sunday morning game day type of show before the NFL, and who are the voices, who do we hear from? So all of this goes back into what stories are most important, what people are most important in leading those discussions. When it comes to violence, we also see an important role that ESPN can play or has played in terms of framing. So back when the concussions and traumatic brain injury were sort of the top of mind news about the NFL, there was a less immediate focus on concussions and long-term effects, and more of a discussion of rule changes and regulations of it, rather than sort of the harm that has been caused by football or NFL participation or these violent collisions. And many critics of ESPN argued that there was a conflict of interest because ESPN is too much in bed with the NFL and major league sports, that they don't want to be undermining their own profits by perhaps turning people off of the NFL. And this also showed up in ESPN's non-participation in the PBS concussion documentary. So they refused to sort of participate in the conversation. We also see the rise of the UFC happening almost alongside this concussions and TBI crisis or controversy. So it's really, if we're thinking about this in terms of framing, it's how ESPN is shifting the focus to focus on sort of the mundane rule changes that happen every year. This is how it's going to impact the game. This is how it's going to impact perhaps a player's style of play, but not necessarily talking about why this rule change is happening, because people are being concussed and having long-term effects with their brain, perhaps premature death, things like that. Focusing more on sort of the very black and white. Here's what the rule was, here's what the rule is going to be, here's how they're going to enforce it, those types of things, which still make it feel very much like a football focus rather than health focus. Also, back in terms of agenda setting and a bit into framing of what the audience wants. When we're thinking of men's versus women's sports, oftentimes we hear the conversation that the audience isn't there for women's sports. That's why they don't get shown on ESPN. Again, this would be an agenda setting thing of what sports make the cut and what sports are shown as most important. But we see an example of the X Games, which are quite old now, but they haven't been around forever. When they first sort of launched the X Games, they had almost zero audience. So it was a very niche sport. Perhaps live audience would get pretty fired up for it, but certainly not a national TV audience. But ESPN poured a lot of money into developing the X Games prior to the PR launch, getting feature pieces on it, discussing critical matchups and rivalries, and building an audience for it. And X Games continues to play out on ESPN, presumably very successfully. So if they could start from scratch on something like the X Games, why couldn't they start from scratch on something like a sport for that women play? We see perhaps some of that with women's soccer and getting the professional league in the United States some more coverage. Though we'll see if it sustains or if that will move into other content. All right, more on framing with ESPN. So the last slide was more of sort of broader framing, agenda setting in terms of sport or gender. Framing in terms of individuals takes a slightly different level or a different scope on it, focusing on a singular person rather than maybe a league or a sport in general. Sometimes this smaller scale focuses on teams. But really, the framing here is all about sort of the phrasing and the words and how we describe what's going on. So we might think of just mistakes versus crimes. So athletes make mistakes if they're able to overcome them and come back. But if they are going to get bounced from the league and never play again, then it's okay to call it a crime and we'll just move on with our lives. So we see things, and the NFL is notorious for allowing criminal activity to be overcome and they come back to the league. But there are some cases where players are just blackballed and don't return. So we have Adam Pac-Man Jones, Ben Roethlisberger, Ray Rice, Zeke Elliott, all involved with either assault or rape allegations, and all had sort of their elements, their moments of where it's a gray area still. ESPN didn't know how to necessarily cover it. There wasn't any sort of like court ruling or anything like that. So they almost always err on the lighter side until public sentiment perhaps turns enough, as it did with Ray Rice. But up until the Ray Rice video was released, where showing him punching a woman in an elevator, ESPN was still on the sort of the softer side of athletes sort of making a mistake rather than committing a crime. We have similar examples of how framing plays out in terms of Adrian Peterson's child abuse events and crime, and Michael Vick's dogfighting. Again, we see a lot of framing happening early on in the Mike Vick story, where ESPN was following public sentiment a lot, really sort of getting on the story and presenting maybe the horror of it. But then also after Vick effectively served his time, reframing it as a sort of a comeback story, getting back into the NFL. Other places where framing comes in is when we're thinking about cheating versus trying to get an edge, just doing whatever you can, being so passionate about winning that you try to get an edge. And again, it isn't necessarily that one way is perfect or one way is absolutely right and the other way is wrong, but it is just a discussion of how framing works and how it can shift how we think about things. So there's been a number of cases, dozens that I can at least think of where teams or an individual player got caught stealing signs in baseball. Red Sox famously not too long ago, and then the Astros championship run very famously, stealing signs and then also signaling the batter as to what pitch was coming. Patriots deflate gate. Patriots have a number of these scandals, and framing almost always goes in favor of the Patriots and just kind of calming things down and moving on. So the ESPN and NFL connection is so strong that everything is toward just trying to put it under the rug and, oh, look, we have a draft coming up, or, oh, look, there's mini camps happening, instead of discussing scandals. So whether it be Ray Rice's or Big Ben's assault cases or alleged rape cases, or Deflategate or stealing plays, Spygate, whatever it is, the framing is always sort of minimalizing it and moving on to the next story, like, oh, let's talk about football again, rather than examine these potential scandals and potential systemic scandals. Other examples, Serena getting coaching during the US Open. Is it trying to get an edge? Is it cheating? Again, how these are all talked about would be the framing of it. Okay, when framing female athletes specifically, oftentimes the media will talk about, or those representing the media are trying to downplay the fact that female sports get less coverage or get different types of coverage than men, saying there are natural differences and the quality of play explains lesser coverage. And oftentimes this men versus women is a false dichotomy of where if women are presented as lesser and that's why their sports aren't on, they're not as good as the professional male teams. That doesn't really hold up, because certainly college sports are lesser than professional sports, and we still see plenty of college sports happening. We even see in the case of football, we see high school football games on, and certainly that would be lesser than college, which is lesser than the NFL. So this, just because it might not be as a high of quality of play, or if the NFL team would beat a college team, we shouldn't watch college teams. It has always been sort of a strange argument. U.S. soccer, we see that argument play out a lot there, as well as one of the reasons why the women's team isn't paid as much. They do get a decent amount of coverage. Women's soccer team gets good ratings, so that the media is actually following that, at least, if they know they'll get a good rating if they put the U.S. national women's soccer team on. But still, there's the pay gap that continues to be an issue. So ESPN, quite a while ago now, launched ESPNW online, which is a page devoted entirely to women's content or women's sports. I'd like us to have our second discussion prompt focus on this edition, ESPNW versus just the regular ESPN, which is ostensibly the male version. So discuss that. Is this mere token coverage? Is it actually an important addition to have a page devoted entirely to women's sports? Would it be better just to have the women's sports as part of the regular ESPN and not a separate page that's sort of off on its own? That does feel a little bit like it's tokenizing it a bit, where it's just, well, we have it, it's over there. You don't have to look if you don't want to, rather than having it part of its own. So discuss that. Is it an important addition? Is it an important step to have them included? Is it mere token coverage? What might ESPN do differently with that? So take a second to pop over to the discussion post, add that, and then come back. All right, last item on this slide is the framing of women within the Olympics specifically, male athletes versus female athletes, and how broadcasters talk about the Olympians. Oftentimes, the female athletes get talked about as mothers, wives, children, and more of a family context in their role within families rather than just as athletes. And the male side gets talked about in terms of their individual accomplishments, their workout regimens, and those are the backstories that get talked about with male athletes. So we can see a clear difference where obviously male athletes are also fathers, husbands, and children as well. So it could easily be talked about where both are talked about individual accomplishment, or both are talked about in terms of their family life. So it isn't to say that discussing their families and their background isn't important, but if there's this complete split, it makes you wonder why female athletes are being talked about in one way and male athletes are being talked about in another way. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about ESPN and these sports leagues. So I've mentioned this a couple times where ESPN is very much in bed with the professional sports leagues, college sports, and they make a lot of their money. So ESPN is far more than just covering sports. They are producing and showcasing and profiting off of these sports as well. And a lot of the rules and control of major sports has shifted to be more TV friendly or more audience friendly. So rule changes in the NFL, the recent increase of games in the season, reducing contact with wide receivers, protecting quarterbacks. All of these are to boost offense, get more scoring plays, which increases ratings. Basketball has implemented shot clocks, reduced time on shot clocks, moved an emphasis towards three-point shooting, taking away hand checking, increased TV timeouts. All of this, again, TV revenue as the focus. And ESPN certainly isn't single-handedly doing this, but the boom of ESPN and the rapid increase of televised sports in the 90s and into the 2000s, it has very much ties with ESPN. Major League Baseball is similar types of rule changes to increase offense, more night games to bring in the TV audience, pace of play rules, things like that. All playoffs across almost all sports, I believe, increased number of teams, more viewerships, more ticket sales, but also more TV ratings. One of the last items that this first reading discussed was college sports and its connection to big TV money. TV money is enormous. That's what's led to all the conference realignment over the past decade and a half or so. All these conference deals, conferences creating their own TV branding like the Big Ten Network, Longhorn Network, SEC, ACC, Pac-12, all have their own networks. ESPN, though, has gone far above mere coverage of sports. Like I said, they are very much driving the ship in terms of scheduling decisions, where they're giving publicity, the ESPN Game Day, highlights, ranking analysis, framing the playoff selection debate, and certainly they show perhaps more college games than anybody, although Fox certainly is right up there as well. The influence is so much so that ESPN, as I said, drives scheduling decisions. So colleges might choose to play a game on a Wednesday night because they'll be the only college football game that's on. So they'll be likely to get ESPN coverage. And we see this a lot with those schools maybe just outside the top tier that want to get national audience. Will play a lot of Thursday night games. So we see things like Boise State playing a lot of Thursday night games. That's an intentional decision to try to get a bigger TV audience. So the discussion prompt number 3, this will be the last discussion prompt for this lecture, and then we'll have some more on the next lecture. Is ESPN's influence and conflict of interest a problem? So is the fact that they are in bed with big college athletics, in bed with the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, is it a problem? A problem in terms of agenda setting and framing and how they frame perhaps scandals by these leagues or players within these leagues? Or is the argument it's just sports acceptable? So if it is just sports and none of it really matters too much, it's like, all right, whatever, there have some scandal within this make-believe football league. It's not that big a deal. It's just entertainment. Keep moving on. Is it just sports, or is it a potential problem for this conflict of interest between ESPN, whose initial job was to cover sports, but now his job is to produce and present and get TV ratings alongside these leagues? So discuss that a little bit, the influence of the conflict of interest, and if it's problematic or if it's just sports. All right, and that is it for this lecture. Be sure to do the second lecture as well.